So the title of my talk today is Overcoming Despair, and human beings have probably dealt with despair ever since they stood upright. And needless to say, we live in a time when it's easy to fall into despair about the state of the world, whether it's the environment, political situation, the multiple wars, the mass suffering in parts of the world, and on and on. And so the challenge for us in terms of our practices, how do we hold all this? How do we hold all this suffering without just being overwhelmed by it or drowning in it? How do we manage a meaningful life, a purposeful life in the face of so much despair? And it will not surprise you to hear me say that it begins with acceptance. Now, let me reiterate, because this often gets confused, is that acceptance does not mean we have to like the things we accept. In fact, most of them we don't like. But it doesn't mean, nor does it mean that we throw our hands up and do nothing. Um, as we often talk about uh, in terms of the Buddha's teachings, despair arises from attachment and craving, by which I mean when we cling to things being a certain way or grasp for circumstances to be different than they are, we open ourselves to suffering. And I can sit around all day and wish that things were different than they were in terms of the environment or the conflicts around the world and all the suffering. But first of all, it doesn't change it. And second of all, it just causes me to suffer. In other words, despair sets in when the gap between our expectations and the reality of things as they are, feels unbridgeable. When that gap, the larger the gap between our expectations and the reality of how things are, the larger the gap, the greater the suffering. The Buddha taught, as you will recall, that life inherently involves and contains dukkha, the Pali word for suffering. And it's typically translated as suffering, but it really is more accurately translated, I think, as a pervasive unsatisfactoriness. Okay. And these things are all around us, in our personal lives, illness, aging, loss, death, and so forth. And even on the positive side, we can experience suffering because the positive experiences are impermanent. They often leave us wanting more of whatever that good thing was. And despair is just an intense form of suffering that comes from feeling powerless in the face of life's difficulties. It's like we're constantly, in a battle that we can't win. But let's not forget that the key message of the Buddha was that there's a way out of suffering. And with the Four Noble Truths, he lays out that path. He gives us the roadmap. First of all, suffering exists. Second one, it arises from craving and attachment. Thirdly, it ceases when craving and attachment cease. And fourthly, the Eightfold Path is the way to achieve it. Despair loses its tight grip on us when we relinquish our tight hold on how we think things should be. So once I let go and drop the rope on how I think things should be, then despair and the suffering that goes with it lessens. You know, we overcome despair not by changing our external circumstances. I mean, we can try, but rarely are we going to succeed. We can't change the world. We can't get the world to conform to our prescription. Rather, we overcome despair by changing our relationship to those circumstances. We shift our relationship to the circumstances which are causing us to despair. In other words, we learn to accept the present moment as it is, and we do this with open and courageous hearts. But as I said a few minutes ago, this doesn't mean we become passively resigned to all the bad things, but we use our discernment to see what is within our power to change. Some things I can change, some things I can contribute to change. I may not change them completely. I can speak out, I can take action, I can write letters, I can do whatever. I can become involved in my community. I can do what I can do, but I have to use discernment to see what is within my power to do and what is just, a fruitless pursuit. And this is where we cultivate wisdom and compassion using our discernment and then direct that wisdom and compassion toward the things we can change. This is the serenity prayer that many of us are familiar with, and certainly those folks that are in the 12-step tradition are familiar with. Accept the things I cannot change and change the things that I can, to paraphrase. And our meditation practice helps us find that internal place of calm abiding, even amidst all the turmoil in the world. That's where we cultivate equanimity, that inner place of loving kindness, which softens the heart, connects us with others, where we share the suffering and we share the acceptance of things we can't change and do what we can as a community and individually to change the things that we can. Now, I find despair, and I've found it over the years in my own life, a particularly painful form of suffering, because if we if we succumb to it, we lose a sense of being able to make a difference. We feel impotent, we feel helpless. It feeds on a sense of isolation. I'm weak, I can't do anything. This is where connecting with spiritual friends and taking refuge in the three gems of the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha provides essential support. We don't want to sit alone with our despair because it will take over. When we talk to each other and share it and share what we can do and what we can't do, we lessen that sense of isolation that it often creates. And we remember that no matter how alone we sometimes feel, countless others throughout history have faced similar struggles and found a way through them. And this is why Sangha is so important. The Buddha and many great teachers since then have given us examples through their lives of what is possible. They keep on going in the face of all kinds of adversity. I mean, just think about the Dalai Lama dealing with the Chinese. I mean, it's a classic example of how he does what he can, but he doesn't despair over what he cannot do. And this is where faith plays a key role. And I talked about faith, not blind faith, where we just believe something, but faith in the form of confidence in the Buddha's teachings and our own potential to use those teachings to awaken and lessen our own suffering. Because when despair descends, then the opportunity is to orient ourselves to what is most meaningful, returning again and again to those highest aspirations. But this path, I need not tell you, requires patience and it requires steadfast effort. Because overcoming despair is not a one-time event. It's not just, oh, I'm done with it. It's an ongoing journey of growth and transformation. It's an ongoing journey of acceptance. It's an ongoing journey of dropping the rope in those situations where we're hopelessly tugging on it. Because with our practice, we touch into an inner freedom beyond conditions. This is what the Buddha was talking about. We don't become prisoners of the causes and conditions in our lives. We see an inner freedom by letting go, by acceptance, and a peace and a wholeness is always available to us, even in dark times. So gradually we learn to live from this deeper place and we cultivate resilience. We experience joy and ease in our lives. And when I come at despair differently than I used to, I really can get a taste for that. I can really, and I'm sure you have as well, you can really just see what the potential is there. Because ultimately, despair is a call to awaken from this trance that we live in of our own limiting stories that we've been talking about recently. The stories limit us. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, nothing matters. Or why bother? Or, I'm just going to give up here. That's the kind of succumbing to despair that will just increase our suffering. But when we turn toward it with mindfulness, with compassion, it's really a door to freedom. We don't run from it. We don't withdraw from it. We turn toward it because avoiding or running away from our suffering and our despair only perpetuates it. These trials that we encounter, these challenges, become our greatest teachers. You know, someone once asked, you've probably heard this story, the Dalai Lama, you know, do you hate the Chinese? He said, not at all. He said, they've been some of my best teachers. I've had to learn, you know, to accept things that I can't change. I've had to learn compassion and letting go. I mean, for him to say that, just, I mean, when I first heard that story, it just absolutely uh, knocked me over because, I mean, think about the suffering of the Tibetan people. And yet he's saying they've been wonderful teachers because I've had to learn to deal with it and do what I can to change it. We discover in our own depths this unshakable refuge that I think he has found, a place of light where the darkness just can't get in. Because despair, and we know this, is a profound sense of hopelessness and defeat. It's a universal human experience, but it doesn't mean we have to be overwhelmed by it or drown in it. Because in the face of life's inevitable suffering, the Buddha's teachings offer a unique and transformative approach to confronting it, which is rooted in compassion, it's rooted in mindfulness, and it's rooted in understanding the true nature of existence that the Buddha taught. He provides us practical tools, he provides profound insights. You know, these can guide us through these dark moments toward greater peace in our lives. So we look to the tools of our practice for a profound and holistic approach to overcoming or at least lessening our despair. Because by acknowledging the reality of suffering, understanding its causes, understanding where it's coming from, follow a path of ethical living, mindfulness, compassion, we transform the despair into a journey of healing and peace and contentment in our lives. Because remember, the teachings of the Buddha reminds us that despair, like all things, is impermanent. It's not forever. And with right understanding and practice, we can find peace and liberation, even in the midst of our most despairing moments.